So by early 1915, Armstrong huts had been erected on the estate. These replaced the tented encampments, and the housing was, they were there for to house the increasing numbers of men that were sort of volunteering for the war effort. That made them capable of billeting upwards of about 1,000 men at a time. The camp provided the perfect location for the instruction in the art of musketry and fieldwork, and entrenching and combined exercises on the open range. The extended point camp at Magilligan was established to supplement the original First World War camp at Lower Dokes, and as highlighted on the Minister Defence record plan that you see there in the top right-hand corner, you can see the layout for it. Magilligan became a noteworthy training hub for the British Army during this early part of the First World War, and after the departure of the Volunteer Army to the Western Front, 1915. During the interwar period, the camp continued as a training ground for reserve battalions of the British Army, at the same time functioning as an important sentinel to the approaches of Lough Foyle. The camp itself was, however, downgraded slightly in 1918, when approximately 6 of the accommodation huts were transferred to the Admiralty, and bed spaces reduced to at least sort of around 300. And this is also reflected in the 1915 plan here that you see. The amendments are made in red. The estate has seen sustained and intensive use by the military over many decades, and of course not least during World War II, including the further construction of the World War II camp, Nissen huts, heavy anti-aircraft battery, and the coastal gun batteries, along with associated shoreline defences, all of which that have proven to have impacted greatly on the overall character of the Magilligan military training camp we see today. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the camp and the wider estate again continued to play a significant role in the training of troops for the British Army, including the more recent Troubles period. An extant remains relating to this era still survive, including the Border Patrol training facilities and observation posts. During the Troubles period, known to the Army as Up Banner, a replica of a Border Patrol base was identified as the Foyle Patrol Base, and the facility was used to train on how to live in and patrol out of hilltop border positions, using only the resources within the post. The sites would normally consist of a metal-clad trilateral compound with 2 9-metre observation towers known as bottom access mat sangers. They were constructed in a modular format. This was for ease of construction and deconstruction, basically. The towers are framed on an 8-leg self-supporting mounts. They got the fence around them, etc. And at one time, observation posts like this here were a familiar sight along our Irish borders. However, these structures are now all removed. And the relic training facility at Magilligan is now a prime example of the rare and enduring structural vestiges of Northern Ireland's recent Troubles period and the associated defensive architecture. So I think sort of looking at these pictures, you get and the slides that I've already shown you, get a bit of a background to the life, a whistle-stop tour basically of the life of Magilligan. So what I want to do now is to give you a bit more information really then on the excavation itself. So these are the target areas. Trench 1, well, we set it out as a contingency trench, not knowing whether we would really need it or not, but trying to understand, and we needed to make sure we would have the capacity for the visitors that we were expecting. So in the end, we didn't use it, and the trench itself remained unexcavated. However, Trench 2 and Trench 3 were excavated, and Trench 2 was positioned northeast, southwest, roughly across what was identified on the surface to have been a trench crenellation. And it was hoped that this would enable an assessment of the actual survival of the feature and potentially the material relative to its actual construction and hopefully its use. Trench 3 was located within the stripwood area, which was just northwest. It was laid out northwest, southeast across Two features that on the surface actually looked like they were related, possibly the backfilled remains of shallow frontline trench and maybe a small dugout. We had hoped that the placement of this trench would give us like a detailed view of a long section view and associated view of the trench system and the practice trenches as a whole in that area, and inform us to their purpose and of course the morphology. And these images here actually show the examples of trench practice trenching at Clandyboy, courtesy of the North Down Arts Museum, from the Blakely collection, which is a fantastic view image of them in Dean, and on Salisbury Plain in 1915. And the plan up in the top right hand corner there is the suggested layout for the section of frontline trenches as you would have imagined them in 1915. So moving on, some results on Trench 2. Trench 2 had fortunately evaded more or less any substantial landscaping or modification. We were quite lucky. Some of the trenches that we excavated at Ballykinder have been substantially impacted on through sort of decades of modification and development. However, we were lucky enough with this area that we dug in Magilligan. The excavation revealed some original breastwork sandbags that were still in situ. And when I say the sandbags were still in situ, it was the ghost of the sandbag rather than actual sandbag. The Hessian outer had obviously sort of deteriorated and disappeared by this stage. So you were getting like the ghost of the sandbag, but very much very visible and recognizable as such. And they were sort of laid out and acted as both force protection and structural support within the practice trench, as would have been the case when constructed on the battlefield. The strata layers in Trench 2 revealed that the cut of the crenellated First World War trench was still apparent and cutting through the old ground surface and still visible up to a depth of 1.2 metres above the natural sand subsoil. The former ground surface was directly behind the sandbag revetments on both sides of our trench, which suggests then that the relic trench was cut prior to the positioning of the sandbag revetment, which during use also revetted the upper layers, the subsurface sides of the trench itself. Worth noting, something that we didn't predict, worth noting, the water table and the winter flooding of the slack floors in this area of Magilligan are adversely high. And for this reason, it appears that this trench and potentially many others across the estate were in fact actually constructed in a manner similar to breastwork trenches commonly seen in Flanders and other areas of wet ground across the battlefields. Evidence for this method of trenching and construction has also previously been identified during excavations at the MOD coastal training site of Barrybudden in Scotland. However, this is the first time that we have encountered this within the Irish setting, which from a personal perspective is actually fantastic for me to learn and everybody else hopefully on the team, but also a great discovery for the volunteers. It took a while to figure out what was going on, but it was great to actually realize what we'd encountered. As you can just see on the screen here, Trench 2, I have marked out in a red dashed line our sort of surface view of the crenellation that we were excavating. And then just below that there, you see the point we got to before we had to finish up. And you can see that we have got the sandbag sort of revetment, the ghosts, as I said, the remains of that there that are still apparent within the trench, which are sort of delineated by that the darks. You can just see the deposits sitting there. And of course, I've popped in a few of the trench drawings just to add a bit of context to it. So and as you can see, the comparison to the fire trenches and the notes that are in the infantry officer's manual from 1915 are quite striking for what we have found actually in the ground at Magilligan. So comparatively, they were definitely following instruction to some extent anyway, so they were. So moving on a bit more, how do we know what I'm telling you? How do we know where we're getting our information from? Well, I've just mentioned the War Office publications, and of course, I'm not a historian. I'm so far from a historian, it's unbelievable. But you obviously have to use the history books, etc. But the War Office publications are just amazing for the field of information that you can gather from these here and actually use it in context on site. So we have the War Office publications from 1916 and the revised version of that from 1921 that we were using as handbooks for the time. And they provided us with illustrations of this type of trench fortification and its recommendations for use, which is importantly within wet soil, well, wet ground as we were using. And for this section of breastwork, we can see that there in the field drawing manual page that I have put into the screen up here in the top left. The inner and the upper surface of the fire trench itself, as suggested by the manual, was revetted, as you can see in the sandbagging, by numerous courses of sandbag layers. And any of the cavities behind these layers were well filled with sand that was excavated from the shallow trench, effectively building up a protective parapet and parados without having to dig down into this waterlogged ground. Also, advancements in trench warfare by 1915, they had dictated that the fire trenches were not dug in straight lines. Instead, the traverses were similar to Trench 2, and what we revealed at Magilligan were created comprising a series of right-angled or near right-angled bends in order to attempt to lessen casualties and damage from explosive projectiles or enemy fire within the trench. The trench appears to have remained more or less in use right through succeeding decades, most likely only completely abandoned around the late 1980s or the mid 1980s, when the area was then given over to plantation and cattle grazing. And we quite easily dated that there, sort of the last sort of time of use based on the squatty rubbish that we recovered, crisp packets and Coke cans, etc. You know, the usual stuff you find out of the NAFI pack. Sort of a lot of modern debris that came up. So there was. So what you're actually looking at there is an example of a First World War trench in Flanders, where you see that the ground is very, very wet. And they've used, whilst they use sandbag revetting on the top of the parapet, etc., they use wooden supports as well, where we would be using, what they have used here at Magilligan were metal trench struts and supports. The other post-excavation plan just sort of shows you the line of the trench, the area that we were excavating in. And of course, you've got your crenellated trench there. But the two metal trench pickets that are lying on the ground here, they were evidence of the trench furniture and the revetment as well. And they were both recovered from the trench. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. So, well, so